Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Friends of ASOR webinar series. My name is Jane DeRose Evans. I'm the ASOR board member and chair of ASOR's Cultural Heritage Committee and your moderator for tonight's program. This webinar features Patty Gerstenblith and two discussants, Lisa Ackerman and Andrew Cohen, speaking about a world at war, protecting cultural heritage in times of conflict. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to say a few words about the work of the Cultural Heritage Committee. This committee informs ASOR members about cultural heritage issues, especially in the regions where ASOR has sponsored projects, and it advises ASOR's leaderships on specific cultural heritage issues such as current and prospective ASOR cultural heritage initiatives projects, or the ways ASOR might interact with the Archaeological Institute of America and the Society for American Archaeology in formulating responses to various cultural heritage issues we may jointly wish to champion, helping to draft statements or suggesting ASOR's participation in actions initiated by others that work to safeguard the world's cultural heritage. Since this program tonight is one of several we hope to present to the public for free, we do hope you'll consider a gift to ASOR's Cultural Heritage Initiatives program. This program supports ASOR's important work with the U.S. Department of State and other non-governmental organizations to safeguard the heritage of Near East and North Africa. A gift of any amount would be deeply appreciated. The link to donate is on the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Our first speaker tonight is Patty Gerstenblith, who is a distinguished research professor of law at DePaul University and director of its Center for Art, Museum, and Cultural Heritage Law. She was appointed by President Obama to serve as chair of the President's Cultural Property Advisory Committee in the U.S. Department of State, in which she had previously served as public representative under President Clinton. Since 2020, she has served as president of the board of directors of the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield and chair of the Blue Shield International Working Group on illegal trafficking of cultural objects. She was founding president of the Lawyers Committee for Cultural Heritage Preservation. She is the editor of International Journal of Cultural Property and is currently the research associate of the Cultural Heritage Center at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Patty lectures and publishes widely on subjects of protection of cultural heritage during armed conflict and the international market in cultural objects. Patty received her AB from Bryn Mawr College, her PhD in art history and anthropology from Harvard University, and JD from Northwestern University. A few reminders: you can write your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to them at the end of the program tonight. Please do not write them in the chat. We'll only be looking at the Q&A for the audience questions. Now let's all welcome Patty to the screen to discuss the very timely topic of how communities can come together during and after times of conflict to protect cultural heritage.
Good evening, everybody. I'm so happy to be here, and I want to thank Jane DeRose Evans for the lovely introduction. I have to make one slight correction just to be sure it's clear. I'm no longer the editor of the International Journal of Cultural Property. I did that quite a few years ago. But I do want to thank her for the invitation to speak this evening and the other members of ASOR's Cultural Heritage Committee as well. I want to thank Felice Herman and Jared Culler for their assistance and great organizational skills, and particularly Jared for his tech support. I want to thank my colleagues, Morad Kursel, Brian Daniels, Corey Wegner, amongst others, who have helped me think through many of these issues and for their constant conversations and insights. I want to also acknowledge the assistance of Dr. Hayden Bassett of the Virginia Museum of Natural History Laboratory and Jeff Brown of PBS for their generosity in sharing some of the images that I will be showing this evening. As I begin, I acknowledge that I am on land just north of Chicago that once belonged to the Potawatomi Indians before their forcible removal West following the Treaty of Chicago of 1833. As we discuss cultural heritage issues and efforts to preserve it, we should remember the cultural heritage and the current culture of Native Americans and their contributions in the past and continuing into the present. This is especially poignant today with the news of Native children who were forcibly removed from their families, made to attend residential schools, and suffered many types of degradation, including death, and attempts to eradicate their culture, especially their languages and Native traditions. Two more caveats as I start. One is I am speaking for myself individually, not as the representative of any organization or institution. I also want to give a warning that I will be discussing some matters that are undoubtedly painful and distressing. Nonetheless, I think we have to discuss these and confront the shameful and distressing actions, in particular, the cruelty that people can show to others. And this is why I'm beginning not with cultural heritage, but with people. These images of the Mariupol theater, probably familiar to most of you, before and after the attack that was carried out by the Russians in a location not only and not particularly or not especially valuable because it's a theater center, an art center, but because it was known that roughly 1,200 civilians were taking shelter there. Nonetheless, the theater was attacked and about half the people, about 600 people, were killed. We know that the Russians have directed attacks against civilian populations, shelters where people were taking refuge, directing these attacks, even in the knowledge that they would cause incidental or intentional loss of life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects and infrastructure, objects that are not military targets, hospitals, other medical facilities, evacuations, humanitarian convoys, forced transfers of populations, rape, torture, use of poisonous weapons. I could go on. I'm sure you are all familiar with these from the news. But in case this sounds familiar, it should, because in Syria, similar atrocities were carried out by Russian aerial attacks as well as by the ASOR regime. And so we have seen this before, unfortunately. Now, cultural heritage destruction does not take place in a vacuum. The first prosecution, standalone, only for cultural heritage, but the prosecution against the Almaty for the destruction of mausolea and mosque in Mali and Timbuktu. This is an unusual case because it is the only one in which the only charge was cultural heritage destruction. Most other cases involve people who did many bad things, and this is only so that cultural heritage was only one of those things. So as I turn to talk more about international law, we have to think about what it can and cannot do. And my emphasis is probably on, unfortunately, what it cannot do. So first, briefly, we can think about what is international law. And we can say that there are three sources. One is conventions and treaties. Second, you see resolutions, declarations, and recommendations, which are what we call soft law, not something that is generally enforceable, with the exception of the UN Security Council resolutions. The third source is customary international law, and that can be binding on countries even without ratification. So speaking of which, conventions are legally binding only on countries that have ratified an instrument, and secondly, after domestic implementing legislation is adopted in some cases. So these are very serious restrictions on what international law can do. Now, over the course of the 19th century, there was a lot of debate amongst military philosophers, historians, and the like, as to, first of all, what is called just war. And secondly, if you have a war, what is the best way to carry it out? Some people were of the view that armed conflict should be carried out with all means possible, without concern for collateral damage, because that would end the conflict as quickly as possible. Other people believed, other historians and philosophers believe, that in fact there should be limitations put on how armed conflict is carried out, so as to be more humane. So the debate was, what is the more humane approach? It is the second one, that there should be limits that essentially won out. And this is represented in the first written code of conduct for armed conflict, the Lieber Code, adopted in 1863 for the Army of the North during the American Civil War. And I won't read all the text here. The Lieber Code applied to all aspects of conduct during armed conflict, but two provisions, and probably a little more, dealt with what we today would call cultural property or cultural heritage. And the first one that you'll see says that places that we would call cultural property should be protected against avoidable injury. And the second has to do with movable objects, that they should not be privately appropriated. They were not subject to being owned privately or destroyed, and their ownership would be settled after the end of the conflict. Now, and this is picked up, these concepts are picked up in the early Hague Conventions of 1907 and 1899, which remained the international law in place until the end of World War II. At the end of the war, several conventions were adopted. These are the basis for international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict, which actually mean the same thing. The early, I will mention the Genocide Convention in a moment, but the main conventions that express these humanitarian views were the Geneva Conventions. These, however, did not mention cultural property or cultural heritage. This was left aside for its own convention, the 1954 Hague Convention that you see mentioned here. Now, I have distilled the provisions down very briefly to really 3 points. First is to prepare before there's a conflict to protect cultural property in case of a conflict. So to safeguard, these are proactive measures to take in advance to protect heritage. Then during a conflict, to refrain from directing acts of hostility against cultural property unless excused by what's called imperative military necessity. And I'm going to talk about all of this again. And the third provision is to prohibit and prevent theft, pillage, misappropriation, or vandalism of cultural property. So we can think of that as an anti-looting, anti-theft provision. Now, that was adopted in 1954. Along with it was adopted the first protocol, also in 1954, which prohibits removal of cultural property from occupied territory by the occupying power. There are also provisions dealing with occupation in the main convention, mostly in Article 5, that says an occupying power should interfere as little as possible with the heritage of occupied territory, except where it is required to protect heritage that was damaged during the conflict, and to cooperate with the local national competent authorities. In 1999, the second protocol to the Hague Convention was adopted and added on various principles, which you see here: proportionality, distinction, and feasibility. So proportionality means that any damage that is done in order to gain a military advantage, the military advantage has to be in proportion to the damage that will be done, or think of it vice versa, to not commit damage which is excessive to the expected military advantage. Secondly, distinction, which means that a party to the conflict has an obligation to distinguish, to know what is a proper military object or military target and what is what we call a civilian object, a non-military object. And feasibility means that you have to do these things to the extent possible. The second protocol also narrows the military necessity waiver. In the main convention, there's really no definition given, and has ended up being mostly what we would call in the eye of the beholder. But in the second protocol, there's an attempt to limit it, to narrow it in various ways, but including the fact that the thing being targeted would have to be used for military purpose right at the time it's being targeted. That's what it means to be dynamic. And military necessity would apply only when no feasible alternative is available to obtain a similar military advantage. I'll also mention Article 9 of the second protocol. It prohibits in occupied territory illegal export, similar to what the first protocol does. And a provision that is familiar to many archaeologists working in the Eastern Mediterranean prohibits excavation in occupied territory other than when strictly required to safeguard, record, or preserve cultural property. And third, it prohibits the alteration or change in cultural property in occupied territory when those changes are intended to conceal or destroy the cultural, historical, and scientific evidence. In other words, not to change the cultural heritage of occupied territory in order to make it more suitable to the occupier, or to divorce it from the people who were living in that territory beforehand. Now, I'll also mention, you see here the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas by the Taliban in 2001, both the before and after pictures. The reason I show this here is that the Hague Convention and the protocols apply during what is called international and non-international armed conflict, but they do not apply during internal disturbances. Now, in the case of Russia and Ukraine, this is obviously an international conflict between two countries, not much of a question. But if we think of Syria, started off as a civil war, and initially it was considered to be internal and only became first a non-international armed conflict and then eventually an international armed conflict. And at that point, these international provisions enter. But at the time the Taliban destroyed the Buddhas, it really was not part of conflict of any sort, or even if there was internal disturbance going on, it was not considered to have reached the level of even the non-international armed conflict. Therefore, when the Taliban destroyed the Buddhas, this was not a violation of international law. Now, of the three principles that I pointed out at the beginning, the first is to prepare during time of peace, which is actually much more difficult than I think we realize, in that it is difficult to get people to accept the idea that they're going to be invaded, or that they might lose, or that they might lose their heritage in the process. And there can be political factors at play as well. We saw this to some extent in Ukraine. We saw this in Iraq before the 2003 invasion. It's a story that has repeated itself. But the failure to protect heritage does not itself constitute a war crime, does not mean that there's any loss of protection. So what can be done? Well, documentation of inventories of collections, museums, archives, libraries in advance. The digitization of collections, you have backup copies from outside the country so that these will not be lost. Things can be placed in storage, and you see here two images of objects that are not movable. These two statues, one in Lviv, the other in Odessa. Immovable heritage is not obviously movable and therefore cannot be protected through evacuation. But collections of movable objects can be put into storage of various sorts, and they can be evacuated. Now, in the case of Ukraine, and in the case of most conflicts that I know of, very rarely has anything been evacuated out of the country intentionally. The first protocol sets up a mechanism for doing this, but it has rarely, if perhaps ever, been used. But evacuation and storage within a country is perfectly legitimate, and it is really the decision of the cultural heritage professionals, in this case Ukrainians, to decide what do they feel is the best way of protecting their heritage. The world community stands by to help and assist, but it is not for us to tell them how to protect their heritage and what they should be doing. But I will say that what's happening in Ukraine has resulted in a great deal of interest in other countries, particularly those that feel they may be in the sights of Russia, in the crosshairs, to themselves start proactively protecting heritage. And you see on the bottom bottom left, Peter Stone, who's the president of Blue Shield International. He has been in great demand to provide training. Here he is in the Baltic states, a group of Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians, also people in Moldova, Georgia, which have, some of them have very active national committees of the Blue Shield. They are now starting to take protective measures, and this is definitely a good thing. Now, turning to the more obvious areas of questions, one question that I'm often asked or often comes up is how is international law, those provisions that I just mentioned in the Hague Convention, how are they enforced? Well, the Hague Convention has no actual mechanism of enforcement within it. The Hague Convention and the protocols leave it to national law for enforcement. So a country, for example, under Article 8 of the convention, a state party is required to establish criminal violations within their own domestic law for prosecuting people who violate those provisions. Similarly, the second protocol, Article 15 and 16 do that as well. Article 15 of the second protocol is interesting because it requires that countries establish what's called command responsibility. So a commander in charge of members of the military, and those members of the military violate the what are considered more serious breaches of the convention, the commander can also be held responsible. And in Article 16, each state has to establish jurisdiction, has to establish provisions for prosecuting people who commit violation in their territory, or if their own nationals do. And in some cases, if an offender, an alleged offender, is present in their territory, then they need to be able to prosecute that person as well. However, and this is a very big however, members of the armed forces or the nationals of a state that has not ratified the second protocol cannot be prosecuted in that way. Now, while this leaves prosecution and enforcement to national law, this is not without significance. We have seen just in the past few days that Ukrainian authorities have announced that they have taken custody of at least one Russian officer who was responsible for some of the atrocities that were committed in the suburbs around Kyiv, like in the Bucha area. You may also be aware that some of the Syrians who committed various kinds of crimes during in Syria have been prosecuted in Europe, I think in Germany and in France, for other violations, not cultural heritage related, but other types of offenses. So leaving it to national jurisdiction is not without usefulness, but may or may not, depending on whether you can get jurisdiction over an individual. In other words, whether you can take somebody into custody is, is the problem, is the stumbling block there. Now, the other way in which these provisions are enforced is through international courts or tribunals. And for many years, there were ad hoc criminal tribunals created, the most famous one of which is the Nuremberg tribunals at the end of World War II. More recently, after the Balkan Wars, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was established. And that, starting in the 90s, and in fact, until 2017, prosecuted various military leaders, both Serbians and Croatians, for various crimes that were committed. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the ICTY in a few minutes. But this was really the end of the ad hoc tribunals. And what has been set up now is the International Criminal Court, which is also located in The Hague. And it operates under the Rome Statute, which was adopted in 1999. Now, the Rome Statute does a couple of things. It allows the International Tribunal to prosecute individuals, so individual criminal responsibility. So it's no longer just a matter for the national courts to do. However, jurisdiction applies to nationals and the territory of a state party after entry into force of the convention. So as I mentioned before, conventions only apply to states that have ratified them and only to acts that are committed after that point. As we'll see, however, a non-state party can accept the court's jurisdiction, but people cannot be prosecuted if their country has not ratified the Rome Statute. Now, the Rome Statute sets up 3 categories of crimes. There's also a 4th called the crime of aggression, and not, at least not the countries involved in the current armed conflict have ratified that part. And actually, I'll come back to who's ratified what in just a moment. Now, the Rome Statute then sets up 3 tiers of crimes. The first is genocide, which is based on the Genocide Convention, defined as the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. So they have to be targeted as part of a group. Notice there is no such thing as cultural genocide. You hear a lot about that in the media and by various stakeholders, but from a legal perspective, there really is no such thing. The second tier is crimes against humanity. And these involve, as you would expect, mostly actions carried out against individuals or groups of people. But it includes what's called a crime of persecution. So the crime of persecution is the persecution against any identifiable group or collectivity on political, racial, national, ethnic, cultural, religious, or gender grounds in connection with any other crime over which the ICC has jurisdiction. So anyone who commits any of the crimes, but does so against, in order to persecute a group, would commit the crime of persecution. And the targeting of cultural and religious sites can be used as evidence that the intent was to persecute a group that belongs to whom the sites that are being destroyed, that are being targeted, belongs. The third category, and probably perhaps the most relevant, is war crimes. You will see there's a long list of war crimes. You will see it includes intentionally targeting attacks or intentionally directing attacks against civilian objects. So as I said, anything that's not military objective, including, so civilian objects include buildings dedicated to religion, education, art, science, historic monuments, as well as many other things, provided they are not military objectives. So there's two things here we need to think about: intentionally, intent to direct an attack, and is the object a military target? So we always have to keep those limitations in place. By the way, the term cultural property is not here. This is really the terminology of the Rome Statute. It's really a throwback over 100 years ago to the early Hague Conventions. A very unfortunate, in my opinion, choice. And secondly, there is no mention of looting of cultural objects. There are prohibitions on looting of civilian property, civilian objects more generally, and cultural property could be protected in that way, but there is nothing specific about looting and theft of cultural objects. So that's sort of a brief run through of the Rome Statute. Now you can ask yourself, to what extent does any of this apply? Most countries, certainly the countries that we've seen involved in conflict over the last several years, are party to the main cultural conventions and UNESCO conventions, the World Heritage Convention 1972, the 1970 Convention, many of you are familiar with, deals with trafficking and trade in cultural objects. Most countries are party to the 54 Convention and the First Protocol. But when we look at the more recent instruments, like the Second Protocol, Ukraine is a party, but not Russia. And the Rome Statute, neither Ukraine nor Russia is a party, but Ukraine has invited jurisdiction, which means that the ICC can come in. It is certainly conducting a lot of the investigations, and it can assist national investigations that are carried out for crimes that are committed within Ukraine, but it would not apply to Russia. So we have this patchwork, which is a real problem from an international legal perspective. Now, I want to focus a little bit or discuss a little bit intentional, what may appear to be intentional destruction. We have reports from Ukraine, damage reports. I've seen slightly different numbers mentioned. One report lists close to 200 sites and buildings that have been damaged or destroyed, including 11 museums, 58 religious buildings, 9 public monuments, and 111 memorial sites. But I want to also focus, when we talk about this damage or destruction, we can't leap automatically to assume that something like a war crime has been committed or a violation of the Hague Convention. So as I said, we have to think about two elements. One is intent, and the second is military necessity or military objective. What's the thing, a military objective? So this is the site of Croix de Chevalier. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. It's a Crusader castle in Syria. And it was, as you see, bombed in 2012 by the Assad forces. And you might just, and it's a World Heritage Site as well, you might just assume that this would constitute a violation, but not necessarily, because not only had civilians taken refuge inside the castle, but reportedly also members of the Free Syrian Army or others who were fighting against the Assad regime. And this might have created, been excused under the military necessity waiver. It's never been fully investigated, so we don't know, and I'll talk about investigations in just a moment, but we need to think about how would we prove whether this in fact was a legitimate military target. We can contrast that with the destruction by the Islamic State of Nabi Yunus Mosque and shrine in Mosul in 2014, where we know that the members of the Islamic State intentionally placed dynamite and explosives around the shrine and simply blew it up, not in the context of fighting against combatants or the like. So although this was considered to still be in the context of non-conflict, this was not in any way a military objective, a legitimate military objective, and it was certainly intentional and would have fit the criteria both under the Rome Statute and under the Hague Convention. Similarly, the site of Dubrovnik in Croatia, during the Balkan conflict, the individuals who carried this out, some Strugar and others who were naval officers who shelled the site from the water, they were prosecuted by the ICTY and were in fact convicted. It was found that there was no military justification whatsoever for the attack on Dubrovnik, which also was already declared to be a World Heritage Site. And again, we can contrast that with the bridge at Mostar. Many of you, again, are probably familiar with it. It was not a World Heritage Site at the time, destroyed by Croatian forces. Now, the bridge linked the Croatian side and the Bosniak or Muslim side. And the Croatian leaders, Praljak and others, were prosecuted, again, for a large number of different crimes of murder, execution, torture, rape, etc. But amongst those things they were prosecuted for was destruction of the bridge. The trial court interestingly held that although the bridge was a military target because the Bosniak forces were using it to bring military supplies as well as food to the other side, the trial court held that although it was a military objective, the destruction was not proportionate. And it also, it was a very important cultural site. The bridge was constructed in the 16th century by a very prominent student, actually, of the architect Sinan. And it also, the trial court also said that destruction of the bridge had serious psychological impact on the Bosnians. However, interestingly, this was reversed on appeal. And some of you may remember in 2017 that at the time the appellate decision was read out, Praljak, one of the main defendants, actually committed suicide right in the court proceeding. But on this charge, he and his co-defendants were in fact, their conviction was reversed, with the appellate court holding that the bridge was a military target and the rest didn't matter. The proportionality, psychological effect, or significance of the site for cultural purposes, none of that was relevant, noting that this all occurred before the second protocol was adopted. So the notion of proportionality, at least the Court of Appeals held, was not relevant, and that the degree of cultural harm and psychological harm did not properly enter into the court's decision. And this brings me to an example from the current conflict in Ukraine. Again, many of you have probably heard that in the early days of the conflict, this museum, the Bankiv Museum, was destroyed. Here you see an image of it. These are aerial images, so looking down from above, February 14th, so just before the conflict started. And you see the museum here in the circle. And then shortly after, in another aerial view, and I do want to thank Hayden Bassett and PBS and the Virginia Museum of Natural History and the Cultural Heritage Monitoring Lab for sharing both the images and, as you'll see in a moment, a short video clip, as well as the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield, who did the video clip. But here you see in the aerial view, almost the same view with the roof of the museum gone and the interior being burnt. Now, the question is, and there are questions as to how it happened, but there's also, perhaps more importantly or relatedly, why it happened. Does it fit the intent, intentional targeting? Does it fit military necessity? Well, it almost certainly does not fit military necessity. I have not heard any reports that the museum was being used in any kind of military function. But I will now let Dr. Bassett pick up the explanation.
Now, important to us in this case and other cases is we've recognized that it's no longer sufficient to just say impacted or not. At the end of the day, that helps a few stakeholders, a few missions in order to prioritize when and where something needs to be responded to. But also we need to focus on the context of impact. We can collect some of that information from open sources, formal media, and things like that, but we can also leverage the imagery we have in front of us to make some of those determinations as well. And I should say not make determinations, but make inferences about what might be happening. In this case, you can look at something like the immediately surrounding buildings, all residential in this case, the immediately surrounding landscape, the trees, the vegetation, and identify that very few, if any, of the surrounding environment has been impacted. It is really confined to the building itself. And while an image can never tell us, an image alone can never tell us intent for why cultural heritage is being impacted, we can begin to infer and use this as just one piece of independent evidence, an independent line of evidence to suggest that this might not be collateral. Again, we can't make that determination from the image itself or the image alone, but it does add one piece to that conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Bassett. So one of the things I particularly like about his explanation is that it brings out that we need to combine different sources of evidence to make determinations that can be difficult, particularly determinations of intent. Was something targeted intentionally? Now, this particular museum housed a large collection of artworks, paintings from an artist, Maria Primachenko, who was very involved in the Ukrainian folk art movement. You see here one example of one of her works. According to Dr. Daniels, the folk art was and the museum was a center of Soviet resistance during the 70s, 80s, 90s. And that could give a reason for why perhaps the museum was targeted. At this stage, we don't know. It's too early to tell. But I will emphasize, as Dr. Bassett said, first of all, just showing that something was destroyed or something was damaged is not sufficient. We need to have information in real time of who was responsible, how was something done, and most importantly, use of all kinds of evidence from satellite imagery to social media accounts, to statements by people on the ground when something happens. Victim and witness statements, eyewitness statements, all of these have to be brought together to make the determinations that are necessary. And I will say that while this documentation of destruction, which goes back to particularly to the work of Elizabeth Stone and later of ASOR and other organizations first in Iraq and then in Syria, we can see how the sophistication has evolved. But I believe it needs to continue evolving, particularly from the cultural heritage side, because those of us who are involved in this are not as accustomed to gathering the evidence and seeing what needs to be proved in order to have successful prosecution. So the last point that I want to discuss has to do with the question of looting. You know, of course, the extensive looting of archaeological sites carried out in Syria during the conflict. This image of sites of looters' pits around the site of Mari in 2014 after it fell under the control of the Islamic State. So far, we are not seeing anything quite equivalent. We know that there is trenching going on by both the Russian forces and Ukrainian forces. There was just a report that some Ukrainian forces discovered several examples of ancient Greek pottery, and they collected it, and they said they're sending it over to the museum to be protected. But well, we have no idea what's going on the Russian side, but we have not seen the same kind of systematic site looting. What we are seeing, perhaps more systematically, are thefts from museums, a topic I will come back to as I conclude, but museum thefts, at least in part, to take objects to Russia. And we're probably going to see similar actions with icons from churches, because if you remember, the Russian Orthodox Church actually started in the region of Kyiv close to 1,000 years ago. And so as the birthplace of Russian Orthodoxy, many of the church elements, such as icons, would be considered things that belong to Russia. There have been allegations that some 2,000 artworks were stolen from 3 institutions of Mariupol by Russia. There was a recent New York Times story, another story, I think, in the Washington Post, 200 gold Scythian objects and other objects supposedly taken from the museum in Melitopol. I guess I threw in the word supposedly because I think if we learned anything, there's a huge amount of fog of war. And reports of thefts are very difficult to discern what is accurate and what is not. But what we can do is look to what Russia did in Crimea after the annexation in 2014. And there are 2 things that the Russians did. One is to carry out, or to continue carrying out, large-scale archaeological excavations, including excavations done, I suppose they would call them rescue excavations, for the bridge that was built between Crimea and Russia. Now, this is occupied territory, but to Russia, it's not occupied. Russia views this as part of Russia. And so whatever they do there, in their view, is an internal matter, not an international matter, and therefore they can do whatever they want. And they have, it seems that they have taken both objects that were excavated, objects taken from museums, they have taken them to Russia. But again, they view this as an internal movement and not international. Of course, to the rest of the world, this is an international movement and therefore a violation, certainly of the first protocol and of Article 5 of the Hague Convention itself. So this is one of the excavations that Russia has carried out during the occupation. Another thing that Russia is doing in Crimea is altering the heritage. Particularly, this is an example of structures that would belong to the Tatar community, and Russia seems to be intent on erasing them, or the Tatar history to erase. And so by remodeling structures, it's a way of delegitimizing or saying that that heritage does not exist. And finally, and I use these Scythian gold artifacts that were on display in Amsterdam in 2014. At the time, Crimea was annexed. These objects came from 3 museums in Crimea and also from a museum in Kyiv. There's been a dispute ongoing since 2014 as to whether these should be returned to the museums from which they came or sent to the national government in Kyiv. And just in October, it went all the way through the Dutch courts. The highest court held that this is national patrimony, national property, and therefore, if returned, it should go to keep. Interestingly, it was not returned before the conflict started, and my guess is that it probably will not be returned anytime soon. And the last question, which I think will come out in the panel discussion as well, why is cultural heritage destroyed or manipulated during both armed conflict and occupation? There are many motivations, but the most interesting is the attempt to alter or take over the heritage of another group to claim it as your own. And we see that particularly with Russia and the Scythians. Russia views Scythians as part of its heritage. And perhaps that is why there is, aside from the fact that they're made out of gold, which always gets media attention, we can see that Russia may be taking many of the Scythian objects in order to claim that as part of its history. We know now, or we see now, that Putin denies that Ukraine is a separate country or that it has its own heritage. And so, as we saw during World War II, during the Holocaust, and continuously in conflicts like in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere, we have seen that to destroy a people or to deny the existence of people, it is also necessary to destroy their culture. And that perhaps is a large part of the motivation for how culture becomes a victim during armed conflict. And with that, I will thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Patty, for that thought-provoking and really heartbreaking presentation. We'll move on to moderated discussion with our panelists. So let me introduce them. First, I will introduce Lisa Ackerman. She's the executive director of the Columbus Citizens Foundation, a nonprofit organization in New York City committed to fostering an appreciation of Italian-American heritage and achievement through a broad range of philanthropic and cultural activities. Previously, Lisa served as the interim chief executive officer, executive vice president, and chief operating officer of the World Monuments Fund, an organization founded in 1965 that has assisted in the conservation and development of long-term stewardship strategies at more than 600 sites in 100 countries. And she also served as executive vice president of the Samuel H. Kress Foundation. At the World Monuments Fund, where she worked from 2007 to 2019, Lisa developed multiple international collaborative projects in conservation. In addition to general supervision of over approximately 60 projects in 40 countries, she is the senior project manager for activities in Cambodia, Iraq, Libya, Thailand, and Tunisia. Next is my fellow Cultural Heritage Committee member, Andrew Cohen. Andrew is currently a government professional using his experience with the legislative process, congressional oversight, and executive legislative branch relations to advise the Internal Revenue Service on congressional affairs. In 2020 and 2021, he was a Brookings Fellow at the U.S. Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. But prior to that, he worked for over a decade advising the U.S. Department of State on international cultural heritage protection and preservation policy, and representing the United States government in bilateral, multilateral, and intergovernmental forums as an expert on cultural heritage. In 2018-2019, as executive director of the Cultural Property Advisory Committee at the State Department, Andrew managed the simultaneous negotiation, signing, and implementation of more than 20 cultural property agreements between the United States and partner countries around the world, including most of the countries in the Near East and the wider Mediterranean. Andrew holds a PhD in Near Eastern archaeology and an MA in classical archaeology from Bryn Mawr College. And unfortunately, our last panelist, Douglas Comer, who is president of the U.S. National Committee of the International Council on Monuments and Sites, has contracted COVID and will not be able to join us tonight. We wish Doug a speedy and quick recovery. We hope that we can invite him back for another seminar in the future. So let's welcome our panelists and Patty to the screen so they can discuss a few targeted questions I have for them. First, in thinking about the title of this webinar, World at War, Protecting Cultural Heritage in Times of Conflict, I'd like to start by hearing your thoughts on how government authorities, local, regional, national, have used cultural heritage to advance a divisive political agenda. Lisa, could you start us?
Sure. I during Patty's talk, I was thinking a lot about the different projects I've been involved in. And what I really came back to was the first time I really became aware of what this all meant was actually in the 1980s. And it was when I was still at the Crest Foundation, but somebody had written a book about the systematic destruction of private homes in Romania. And in the name of the Ceausescu regime's view about private ownership and collective living situations, they were systematically bulldozing towns that were in more rural, less populated areas. And so this very moving book that had been written that, came across my desk for whatever reason, was somebody watching not only the home he grew up in, bulldozed on a Saturday morning, but watched his entire town disappear and literally the name of the town removed from the map, and they were all moved into collective housing in the capital city. And I at that moment in my life, I had thought about all of this in terms of its artistic and cultural values, but I had never, it had never dawned on me. Maybe I was a very stupid 30-year-old, but that book just changed my life in terms of understanding that, a political body could so impact not just your moment of life today, but erase your history. And I think what we saw over and over again in Iraq and in Syria, in the Balkan Wars in the 1990s, that nothing is more important than human life, and no building is ever going to be more important than people. But buildings are a tremendous reflection of who we are, where we've been, how we got here. And so attacks on buildings or monuments or religious places can really strike at the heart of people. And so I think the answer to your question is we could all name far too many examples. And what we all need to think about is, when was that moment when we realized what this all meant to us?
And thank you for that really poignant reminder that this really is about people. It is not about buildings and statues, even though that's the physical way that we can measure some of this anyway. Andrew, how about you?
Well, for me, Cyprus comes to mind. Cyprus in the 1960s was a place where intercommunal violence included the destruction of tombs, churches, mosques, shrines, and monuments. And then following the invasion of the island by Turkey in 1974, and the division into two relatively homogeneous communities, the losses continued at heritage sites, and buildings were stripped of movable objects like icons and prayer rugs. And my intersection with it was to see those things trafficked to the US, when even fixed elements of buildings like mosaics were removed and then purchased here as collectibles. So after 1974, it's the destruction of out-group cultural heritage in Cyprus, aligned with a political agenda of really establishing and preserving the rights of these two now self-governing ethnic groups. But it's not all bad news, because during in 2008, the UN and the EU began supporting these different technical committees to try to bring the two communities together. And so there's a bicommunal technical committee on cultural heritage. And since that time, they've done more than 70 projects, preservation projects. And even won just last year, they won a really prestigious European Heritage Award. So Cyprus, in some ways it represents the worst of things, but it can also be a model for how cultural heritage can contribute to mending a broken society.
Thank you. And that kind of leads into my second question. And have you, or the people you've worked with, maybe archaeologists or ethnographers or town elders, tour guides, have they been involved in protecting cultural heritage during a conflict or following one? Can you tell me about maybe some ways that people that are in the area during the conflict that they play in protecting cultural heritage? I'll start with you, Andrew, since you brought up some of this stuff in Cyprus.
Sure. Well, I was involved in protecting cultural heritage in Syria and Iraq and Libya at the State Department. And there, we foresaw that the conflict in Syria was going to affect cultural heritage. And in 2013, we began to publicize the problem. We produced a map of cultural heritage sites at risk. And then through the International Council of Museums, we produced an emergency red list of Syrian cultural objects at risk. In 2014, though, we sponsored with ASOR cultural heritage initiatives to document and protect and preserve cultural heritage in Syria and Iraq and then Libya. And really the bulk of ASOR's work was documentation, but there was one really exciting project. It was a low budget, high impact project at in the little town of Bosra al-Sham, Syria, which is a World Heritage Site. And part of the work that State Department and ASOR supported was securing the collection of objects that was held by local authorities. But another part of it involved removing vegetation and the debris of war from the Roman theater in the town. And then after that cleanup work was completed, the locals gathered and they held a film festival there. And they made movies with cell phones and projected them on a screen that was erected there in the theater.
That's great. That's great. And did they get that? Did they get those films out to a wider audience on YouTube or something?
Not that I know of, but it's possible.
That would be great to see. Well, how about you, Lisa? Have you a story about some local, or people that you've worked with that have really brought this forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of examples come to mind. I mean, and they're, they go from, the small to the grand, but I think one thing that comes to mind is the way people do rally together. And because of social media and the internet, a lot of communication keeps going. So we learn about things more quickly, and sometimes we understand what we're getting the information on, sometimes we don't. But I think, some examples of the resiliency of people and the desire to keep that connection. I mean, when problems really began to really force people not to go to archaeological sites, continue their work in Libya, Susan Kane at Oberlin College, I think, went to Herculean efforts remotely, and sometimes when she could go to Libya, to keep the team that she'd been working with for years together. And through communication, they were going out to the site and doing whatever protective measures they could. They were taking photographs. And it's not always buildings getting blown up. One of the things that she reported heavily on was suddenly roads being built places, or encroachment on buffer zones of archaeological sites where suddenly there'd been open fields and suddenly houses were being built. So, I think that those kind of efforts, it was documentation, it was trying to alert the larger world that these things were happening. And, that can seem not so important at that moment, but it really was. It was tremendously important to understand. And then I think in certainly my work in Iraq, when I was with World Monuments Fund, all of the people who kept working through ISIS. I mean, we were working on a project in Babylon that never stopped. I mean, it was far enough south that it was safe, but, people really, they had to go through multiple checkpoints to get to the site. Security was very high. And, the little bit of effort we were able to make by continuing our missions to the site and continuing to work with our colleagues. I mean, it was just tremendously impressive to see people go to work every day where life was really hanging in the balance for them. So, I mean, my work was mostly, at the time on Skype and the other ends of emails, but I did have colleagues from World Monuments Fund who continued to go, one of whom was an architect living in Aleppo. And, probably the worst moment of my life was getting a call from him while he was at Babylon that he couldn't go back to Aleppo. And his, wife and daughter were trying to get out of Aleppo to Turkey. So, that was not something I ever thought I would deal with. But, again, people just kept going. And I think that was the lasting impression from my years at World Monuments Fund was against all odds. People went out and put sandbags around monuments, got objects to safety. I mean, most of us would never think we could drum up that kind of heroic effort. So, like Andrew, you're just impressed with what people keep doing in the face of adversity.
And that's a great segue to my last question. The ASOR Cultural Heritage Committee is planning on more webinars like this one, focused on different areas of cultural heritage. We also contact ASOR members to ask them to write in support of the MOUs for countries where ASOR is working. But can you tell us, are there others? It's wonderful to hear about what the local people are doing, and we feel sometimes kind of helpless over here where we're getting these emails and getting these calls. But are there specific actions do you think that people in the audience tonight could take to help in the efforts to protect cultural heritage in danger zones? I'll start with you, Lisa, since you were last up.
I think that there are a lot of things people can do. And for one thing, you can support organizations like Blue Shield and ECOMOS and, the various Engineers Without Borders, et cetera. I mean, all of the groups that try to help our colleagues in times of need. And it's not that I'm soliciting money for these organizations, but it's a reality. They've got international networks. They've got the people who can get onto the ground. They are tied into the humanitarian network. So that's one way. The other way is just that when there's calls to sign petitions or, contact your congressman, et cetera, voices matter. And that's one way. I think the other thing is for people actively working in the cultural sector, you want to stay in touch with colleagues I know when things were beginning in Syria, just getting as much information out as possible and being a megaphone for what's happening. It can seem very small. We ran a petition when we put Aleppo or when we put Syria on the World Monuments Watch list. We ran a petition and got more than 10,000 signatures to then present to say, there really needed to be efforts to help our colleagues. And so, it all may seem like you're not necessarily saving anyone, but, it's also just showing solidarity. I think that, again, with the work in Iraq that we did, a lot of it was just showing people we stood by them in difficult times and, answered emails at crazy hours of the day and, got on Skype to talk to people and also getting supplies in. There were a lot of efforts just to get materials to get buildings, these very dramatic images of gigantic monuments under sandbags. That takes an incredible effort, but, it is one way to hopefully protect monuments. So.
Yeah, thank you. How about you, Andrew? Do you have any suggestions?
I wanted to amplify one of Lisa's about supporting the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield, because, you know, protecting cultural heritage in normal times is really difficult. There's a lot of stakeholders. There's different government agencies, each of which has different cultures. And then, I mean, to speak of culture, and then there's independent operators of heritage sites and museums, cemeteries and shrines. And, you know, a nonprofit that's neutral provides a space where people can get together and talk through issues and leave aside institutional cultures and egos to a certain extent. Now, so that's what happens in normal times, but then in a conflict, it's even more difficult to coordinate all those interests, because now you've got a military dimension, you've got displacement of people, you've got humanitarian crises and disruption of basic services. And so the national committees, like the US Committee of the Blue Shield, can really help us prepare for the worst, both here and abroad. You know, some of the, and on a different topic, to, you know, what Lisa mentioned about Syria and, you know, this sort of fire hose of information coming out, that was really true. There were new videos about losses to sites and museums were coming out daily on YouTube. There were all kinds of news stories and then brief snippets of information on Twitter. And so all that is to say that it can be really difficult to separate trustworthy news from misinformation. And I think as we increasingly see information weaponized as misinformation in the course of a conflict like in Ukraine, we really have to be careful about what we share and what we listen and what we consume. So try to pay attention to credible sources like the Smithsonian and the Virginia Museum of Natural History, the Art Newspaper, and many other news sources. And then finally, people have to refrain from buying art and collectibles from war zones. I think dealers in art and antiquities are generally aware of the issues around selling objects taken from museum collections and archaeological sites, but it's the specialized dealers, like dealers of religious artifacts, books, manuscripts. They're the ones that are less likely to be aware of the issues, or they may even see themselves as saving these kinds of objects. But really hoarding them in a personal collection where they might be uninsured and totally dissociated from their original context is really not saving them. And so that's a strong argument, I think, for keep not buying them and turning dealers into the police.
Patty, I saw you unmuted yourself. Are you going to put your oar in the water about the Blue Shield?
Well, I want to start by thanking both Andrew and Lisa for their product advertisements. I did not put them up to it, but I do want to explain, because I realize not everybody necessarily knows what the Blue Shield is. And I did show on some of my slides, tucked in various corners, there were some images of Blue Shields, but the Blue Shield is the international symbol of cultural heritage, equivalent or intended to be equivalent of the Red Cross, Red Crescent. It can be used to mark cultural heritage workers and protectors and transports of cultural objects. And it can be used to protect sites. Now, it's become somewhat controversial whether to actually put Blue Shields. If you go through Europe, you'll see lots of Blue Shields everywhere. But in the United States, for example, there's so far, although I got an email today that might indicate otherwise, but so far there's been no interest in putting a Blue Shield on any cultural site in the United States. But in the Balkan conflict, where Blue Shields were put up on particularly religious churches and mosques, it actually, they became targets because they had the blue shield on them. And when the war in Ukraine first started, people were first rushing and saying, oh, everybody's got to put a blue shield up. And then people stopped and said, maybe no. So one does not lose protection by not having the shield. But of course, if there is a property marked with the shield, then you know that that's something that will be protected under the Hague Convention. And yes, if anybody's interested, we have a website, uscbs.org. And many of you know Nancy Wilkie. She was the second president of the US committee. There are now about 30 national committees around the world, as well as Blue Shield International. So thank you for the plug.
I'd just love to add one last comment, which is we're talking about heritage in times of conflict. And Andrew mentioned that, even when there is no conflict, documenting cultural sites and protecting them has its challenges. I would also like to say that even in the face of natural disasters, a lot of what we're talking about is the same. You can't always help if there isn't good documentation. So, the ability to know what you have, taking preventive measures to the extent you can. But, even in times of terrible natural tragedies, whether it's an earthquake or wildfires or whatever, the unfortunate hurricanes that come to mind. I mean, a lot of this comes into play then too. The humanitarian efforts have to come first, but it's as devastating to lose a temple in the Kathmandu Valley because of an earthquake, or the terrible devastation after Hurricane Maria. And what you find is because of the world in which we live and the kind of assault of information, it can be very easy to forget how long it takes to climb out of tragedy, whether it's armed conflict or natural disaster. I mean, you look at Haiti, and at the earthquake was more than a decade ago, and repairs are still being done, towns are still being rebuilt. This all takes a long time, and just because it's left the front page doesn't mean these things don't happen. And I think Andrew and I can probably attest to that for Iraq and Syria. It'll be a long time before these places are whole once again. And sadly for Ukraine, I mean, we're going to be saying that years from now too, but it's all one set of problems, and we just look at it through different lenses at different moments.
Thank you. Well, I think we can turn to, well, first, actually, thank you so much for those thought-provoking answers, questions, and those wonderful insights. I want to remind the audience that you can write questions for our speakers in the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we're going to be selecting some for the most relevant ones for our speakers to answer. I'll read them out loud for the speakers and ask if particular people would be interested in answering them. And we have our first question already for evidence on intent by Russia, and this sounds like it's going to be directed at Patty. How about Putin's statement or statements delegitimizing the idea of a separate Ukrainian nation and culture? Would that count?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously this is something that many people have been thinking about, and you'll notice even many people have started to use the term genocide in relation to not cultural genocide, but genocide in its technical term. So it comes down to the question of whether Russia is targeting Ukrainians as a people, as a culture, which kind of is a two-edged sword, because at the same time, Russia is denying that they are a separate people or a separate culture. That Russia is saying, oh, you're actually all Russians. I mean, the Ukrainians obviously don't see it that way, and I think the rest of the world doesn't see it that way. So it's going to be way above my pay grade someday for somebody to determine, was the intent to destroy Ukrainians, to kill them, as a way of eradicating them as a people, as an ethnic, religious, other distinct group. Or, and the same goes with, I think, I'm not sure if it's the same question, one of the other questions, is it a crime against humanity because they're being targeted for their culture? And we're back to that kind of same really difficult question of, is this site, be it a museum, be it a church, be it a mosque, because there are mosques there as well, or a Ukrainian Orthodox versus a Russian Orthodox church and the like, are they being targeted as part of a group intent to persecute a particular group? And I think, days are early yet. We're going to have to somehow, somebody will have to make a decision. What is the group? How is that group to be defined? And I'm not sure who really is in the position to do that. I hope that makes sense. And in some ways it's responsive.
Yeah, it does, and that made me think, I'm sorry, I'm injecting my own question in there. I think that, is that legal? How to do that?
You can do whatever you want. You're the moderator.
You noted that the Russian Orthodox Church had its roots in Ukraine 1,000 years ago, but they consider themselves separate orthodoxies at this point.
Yeah, well, there's a Ukrainian church and a Russian, Ukrainian Orthodox and Russian Orthodox. And I wouldn't say I'm an expert in this, and then there are actually like two churches. Like there's a Russian Orthodox church, which is, I have to be careful, loyal to or goes along with the Russian government. And then there is an element of the church that is against that. And there's an element of the Ukrainian church, which is pro-Russian, and an element which is not pro-Russian. So there are, and I apologize to anybody who may be listening or later listening who knows more about this than I do, because there's probably a lot of people who do. But it's a very complex, we're used to this in the Eastern Mediterranean region. And I'll add one more thing about how you define the group. There's this whole question of, do you define a group based on language? Because it's clear that Russian and Ukrainian are different languages, but there are many Ukrainians who speak Russian, fluent in Russian as their first language. And how you again, what is the marker? There's religion, there's language, there's, other cultural elements, literature, theater, music, arts. It gets to such a fundamental question of how then do we define a group? And I'm not sure that we on the outside are the ones who should be doing that defining. It probably is something that has to generate from within of the group. But if we hypothetically think of someday there being a prosecution before the International Criminal Court, I'm not saying there will be, but if there were, then some judge or group of judges is going to have to make that determination. And it will be certainly an interesting day for all of us who are observing, but I also think a very fundamental decision from whether we call it an anthropological or humanistic perspective.
Yeah, and that comes to the second question from the audience. Then the destruction of cultural heritage is thus the question is, should the destruction of cultural heritage be considered a crime against humanity?
As I said, again, it's going to depend on, so it would fit under this crime of persecution that I mentioned. But, in the Balkan Wars, it was easy to see. You had three groups that were defined by religion and by language and by history. So, you had the Serbs and the Croatians and the Bosnians, and you could see one group come in and destroy all the churches or all the mosques of a different group. It was much easier, not that it's ever easy, but it was easier. In Ukraine, I think it's going to be more difficult to determine, is this a political matter or is it really a matter of ethnicity and group identity? And as I said, I think we can see contradictory approaches from, what is Russia trying to accomplish here? Is it just a land grab? Is it just, we're going to grab all your wheat like they did in the Holodomor in the 30s? What are they trying to, are they trying to destroy a group because they are a group? However, we're going to define that group ethnically, religiously, culturally, etc.
Okay, I have a really long question here. Shortly after the commencement of the Iraq War in 2003, the National Endowment for the Humanities inaugurated a special funding opportunity to support the preservation of Iraq's cultural heritage. Clearly, one of the motivators for that action on the part of the U.S. federal agency was the U.S. engagement in activities related to the destruction of cultural resources and monuments in Iraq. Additionally, there was a sense that Iraq, as a key part of biblical Mesopotamia, held special significance to our descendant Western heritage. Andrew just referenced the U.S. response through its grants to ASOR to heritage destruction in Syria and related ISIS territories. Has the war in Ukraine resulted in recognizable destruction of cultural heritage on a sufficient scale? And does the current war, where there is no similar direct U.S. involvement to what was seen in Iraq, nor any general Western, e.g. biblical heritage connection, warrant a similar federal special funding opportunity? Andrew, maybe you can start us off on that one. Did you get all the points on that one?
I believe so. In this case, well, first of all, I would say that that the U.S. should always be willing to support the preservation of cultural heritage to the extent that it's feasible through the kinds of programs that we have set up, like at the Department of State's Ambassadors Fund for Cultural Preservation, or through the National Endowment for the Humanities. It ends up being a political choice whether or not a situation merits some special program. And that might be made at Congress, and less, that's most likely made at Congress. Patty or Lisa, do you have any other thoughts?
Well, I think the main contribution that the US government can make right now is what I can think of 2 or 3 things, but one is this documentation of possible war crimes, such as what I showed from the Virginia lab working with the Smithsonian. And that's really a contribution. Obviously no Americans are going to go in on the ground in Ukraine, to fight or preserve heritage or any of those kinds of things, while the conflict is going on. But there are things we can do remotely. And the first one is this documentation and assisting with that. I also think providing monetary support for, we know that from other parts of Europe, particularly Poland, Germany, supplies are being sent into Ukraine to help protect the heritage, to store it, to wrap it, and to protect it in that way. The third thing that I really think the US government needs to reach out to do is to work on the visa programs for refugees, including not only scholars at risk, but also museum professionals, curators, others who don't necessarily easily fit into like a refugee scholar program. And we've seen this with Afghanistan, where last summer, everybody was rushing and saying, okay, everybody get out, the United States is going to accept all these people and all this kind of stuff. Well, most of that didn't happen. And we're seeing this again, it's very difficult to get people, refugees from Syria back in the mid-2010s, now from Afghanistan, and possibly also moving forward from Ukraine. We have to use, to the extent we have political clout, which we don't, but if we did, we should be using it to support colleagues in these countries who need it, whether they're staying And this is something that Brian Daniels from the University of Pennsylvania has worked on a great deal, whether they stay in country to protect their sites, to protect their collections, their museums, or and their libraries. There's been a lot of digitization from the libraries and the archives going on. But we have to be, as a country, we have to provide support to the refugees. And we simply, again, despite what you read in the newspapers, we're not doing it.
Another question, or these are tough questions. The Dalai Lama has urged those outside of Tibet to collect Tibetan art in order to save it. And the ancient objects of Afghanistan seem to be more in danger from the current Taliban government than protected by it. Though we heartily support the efforts to curtail the antiquities market dealing in stolen objects, what do you think should be done in these cases? Andrew, I'm going to throw that to you since you brought up the dealers.
Well, that's certainly a question for which there's no easy answer. I think there was a model in the course of the Syrian conflict where museums proposed to be able to temporarily house objects pursuant to an agreement that they made with the holder of the objects, with the intent to return the objects once the conditions permitted. And that may be the clearest model.
Elisa, do you have any thoughts about that?
Oh gosh, you know, none of us are ever going to condone the illegal, export of objects or, trafficking in objects. But we obviously need some flexibility in protecting objects. And it's complicated because in these moments of conflict, it does mean you're taking a side if you allow something to leave. I mean, when the Taliban first came to power in Afghanistan, there was a great desire to move a lot of the objects to safe storage in Switzerland, and it couldn't happen because we have laws that prevent letting objects leave their country of origin. There are real fears when an entity comes to power that may not support kind of a pluralistic society and understand the layers of culture that may be part of centuries of history of habitation in a place. So, I mean, we obviously need some flexibility, but if you do that, if you were to move objects out, I mean, you are inherently taking a political side. And then what's the guarantee that they come back if you don't like the entity that's now in charge? And how long can objects sit outside of their country? So there is no easy answer to this, but we obviously have an important set of international laws and agreements on the books. And, sometimes we need some flexibility in how we accomplish this. And I mean, I don't have an answer to that, but, you don't want to see a country in crisis also denuded of its movable objects. So, there's the Dalai Lama encouraging people to, collect objects does not necessarily mean they're doing that in conflict with any laws that are on the books. So, I mean, it's different if you're actually moving things out under cover of night and, selling them illegally. So I don't know what to say to that, but I think that we all agree there is a flaw in the law that we have because we watch things be destroyed, and none of us want that.
I add quickly to that, and more maybe in some ways picking up on Andrew's point. There is a desire and a need to be able to place things in other countries temporarily for, we call it safeguarding or safe haven, and the like. And in fact, the first protocol to the Hague Convention has a provision exactly for that. what Andrew was referring to was the legislation adopted in 2016, which imposed import restrictions on cultural objects from Syria, but also allowed somebody who was bringing something from Syria to, if they could show that they were the legitimate holder, to place it in the United States for protection temporarily. Because we have to distinguish between something being taken for safeguarding with the goal of returning it, as opposed to the market. And the market, in my opinion, is not a way of safeguarding or preserving objects. In fact, it would only, objects that are in the ground are well protected in the ground for the most part. Looting them out of the ground is not a means of protecting them. Museum collections, things that are already out, or library and archival collections, are things that can be taken, if the circumstances allow, placed somewhere else for safekeeping and returned at a future point in time. And that is the model. I think what we need to do is take what was in the Syria legislation and expand it and make it more broadly applicable.
All right, we have time for one last question. History is written by the victors. In current times, would this still be true in light of the presence of social media, freedom of speech for recording of recent historical events, etc.? Does it make a difference how such events are recorded and the looting and destruction of cultural heritage that occurs hand in hand with armed conflict? Would it make a difference in the prosecution of people accountable for these atrocities? Who wants to go for that one?
Well, I'll let Patty handle the prosecution piece. I mean, I think, history is written by the victors is, of course, to a certain extent, always going to be true. But I do think social media and our ability to exchange information in myriad ways helps a fuller, richer story to be told. And I think we're demanding that more and more in the cultural heritage sector, as well as in other avenues. So, I mean, I feel quite hopeful that as we move forward in time, there will be history still told by the victors, but there will be more opportunities to understand the full breadth of actions and historical periods.
Yeah, there's probably going to be, competing historical narratives that are built on their own sets of data and evidence that are compiled during the course of a conflict.
Yeah.
Saying that, even in World War II, which we think is a relatively easy to understand conflict, the way it is taught in the Soviet Union / Russia is very different from the way it's taught in the United States or in Western Europe. And there are many, many facets that obviously I don't have time to go into of that, but there are heroes that are known in some countries that are completely unheard of in other countries, and vice versa. And why is that? Because some places, communists fought against the Nazis, just like the Western democracies did. The Western democracies are not going to make heroes out of people who are communists, and vice versa. So even, as I said, something that we think we understand and is relatively clear, it really is not clear. But the victor's justice is also to do with who gets prosecuted for a crime afterwards. And that's where, again, in most cases, whatever country wins the quote unquote wins the war, you will not see, nobody was prosecuted for the carpet bombing of Dresden at the end of the Second World War. And I think that one of the advantages of the International Criminal Court is that theoretically it could be somewhat more even-handed, but countries like the United States have not ratified the Rome Statute. So our people cannot, our military cannot be prosecuted under it. So you already see that a country like the United States and various other militarily powerful countries have chosen not to ratify the convention for the exact reason that they do not want their members of their military prosecuted if they show up in a country, in another country, where they could be turned over to the court for prosecution. So until we have a more even sense of how international law will be applied, I'm afraid that victors often escape accountability.
That's a kind of a depressing note to
Sorry. That's my job.
Yeah, but we are. I thank you for the great questions that we've got here. But we are out of time, and we really should wrap this up. But I also want to thank the sponsors. We are going to be in touch by email about our upcoming events for the fall, but mark the calendars for the next webinar as Sunday, August 28th, which is the next year already, the next academic year. Elizabeth McCauley will be speaking. Please check your email box for other announcements and registration links that will be coming along towards the end of the summer. I would like to remind you that ASOR would like to remind you that you can purchase a link for the recording of any past FOA webinar, excuse me. You can buy the bundle of all the webinars from 2020-2021 season, or you could view any webinar using the ASOR's online library platform. The easiest way to access the online library is to register for the 2022 annual meeting that's going to be in person in Boston and a virtual meeting before that. The online library currently includes all past FOA webinars and recordings of all 11 lectures from the Webinarathon to Endow Diversity at ASOR. That was a 3-day event. And also all the recorded content from the 2020 and 2021 virtual annual meetings, including over 800 paper posters and workshop presentations, as well as 2 virtual museum tours. So thank you again, everyone, for attending tonight, and we'll see you all in the fall.